9. Frozen iguanas. In early 2018, Florida was hit with a bomb cyclone that brought temperatures in some areas to record lows. Anyone who's lived there for a long time wasn't surprised to see frozen iguanas scattered across the ground on their backs. It's happened a few times before, including in 2008. But it would certainly be a shocking sight for any newcomers to the Sunshine State. The iguanas fell from trees when they became frozen and could no longer maintain their grip. And while they seem dead, many, if not most, initially survived this cold weather-related paralysis. In fact, the reptiles go into this state as a survival mechanism. To conserve energy, their metabolism automatically slows way down to the point of almost stopping, causing them to enter a state of reduced activity called a torpor. Larger iguanas are more likely to survive being frozen, according to Zoo Miami Communications Director Ron McGill, who told the New York Times that he believes the creatures are evolving to tolerate colder temperatures and may soon start creeping their way north. Many of the frozen iguanas perk right up as soon as the weather warms up, and those who survive pass on their hardy genes. Only time will tell if McGill's theory is true. Number 8. Vladimir Komarov. Soviet cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov accomplished some impressive yet downright depressing firsts during the Cold War space race. In 1964, he commanded Voskhod-1 spaceflight. It was the 7th crewed Soviet spaceflight, and the first to be crewed by more than one person. 3 years later, in 1967, he became the first Soviet cosmonaut to fly into space more than once when he was chosen as the test pilot for the Soyuz 1. And sadly, while Komarov wasn't the first cosmonaut to die in space, he was the first to die on a space mission. A lot went wrong during the Soyuz 1 test flight. Sensors, antennas, and other equipment malfunctioned, keeping Komarov trapped in orbit longer than planned. On his way back to Earth, his capsule's parachute failed to open. The capsule crashed to the ground at full speed and exploded, reducing Komarov's body to a disfigured and charred mass measuring just 12 by 31 inches. His ill-fated plunge to the ground was overheard at U.S. listening posts in Turkey, where National Security Agency personnel listened to the doomed cosmonaut, telling agents on the ground that he was about to die. Despite the failed mission's setbacks, the Soviet space program continued, and Komarov was remembered as a trailblazer of interstellar travel. Number 7. Gold. To many, it seems like a dream come true for gold to fall out of the sky. But civilians were lucky no one got hurt when it happened in the frigid Siberian city of Yakutsk in 2018. Something went wrong with a Cold War-era cargo plane packed with $378 million worth of gold, platinum, and diamonds during takeoff from the region's airport, causing the treasure to spill out of the aircraft and onto the ground below. Nearly 200 gold ingots weighing a collective of 3.4 tons rained down, with most of it landing on the airport runway. Valuables continued to fall out of the plane over a 10-mile stretch as it flew to another airport to make an emergency landing. Luckily for the mining company that owned the precious cargo, most of the items were retrieved. This may not have been the case if the incident occurred in a more populated region. But as one of the few inhabited parts of the Siberian high Arctic, the area surrounding Yakutsk isn't exactly teeming with activity. In a statement, the airport reported that the plane's cargo hatch ripped off, while transportation officials suggested that the crew may have secured the cargo improperly before takeoff. Either way, it created a mess, but the outcome could have been worse. Number 6. Loon fallout. If even a tiny amount of ice forms on the wings of a plane while it's in flight, things can become deadly fast. The ice deforms the wing's shape, thereby decreasing lift, and also it adds weight to the aircraft, which then has to work harder to stay aloft and runs the risk of simply falling out of the sky. Apparently, the same aerodynamic principles apply to certain birds. In early 2023, dozens of loons crash-landed in northern Wisconsin after their wings began to ice while flying at high altitudes. Sometimes loons collide with the ground after mistaking wet pavement for water, according to Marge Gibson, the founder and director of the Raptor Education Group, who spoke with Wisconsin Public Radio in April. But she said this wasn't the case in the recent episode of Loon Fallout, which caused birds to appear in pastures, forests, and other places they wouldn't normally land on purpose. Loons can't walk. Their legs are designed for paddling, so they always aim for water. Unlike most other bird species, they can't perch themselves in a tree to wait out a storm, making them especially vulnerable to bad weather. And just like a plane needs a long enough runway to lift off, the species needs a spacious body of water in order to take flight. Not even a small pond is big enough, and most of the birds who survived the initial fall landed nowhere near water, period, leaving them stranded and in need of rescue. Gibson told WPR that loon fallouts are rare, but they're still problematic for the species' population in Wisconsin, which is declining. At least 25 loons were saved after the most recent fallout, thanks to the quick response of conservationists and bird rescuers. Number 5. A flaming basketball? Dustin Prokita's life was turned upside down without warning one evening in 2022, when a flaming object struck the porch of his Englebright, California home. The blaze spread rapidly, giving him just enough time to rescue one of his 2 dogs and escape before the house was fully engulfed in fire and smoke. His home burned to the ground, forcing Dustin and his wife to start completely over with nothing but the shirts on their backs. As residents gathered to watch firefighters combat the out-of-control flames, several people mentioned seeing a mysterious glowing object falling from the sky right before Dustin's house was hit. Footage captured by a neighbor's doorbell camera showed a flaming projectile crashing straight into the home. Dustin and numerous others began to speculate that the object, which he described as resembling a flaming basketball, was a meteorite. It's extremely rare for meteorites to land anywhere near people, let alone hit their house, but it was the most logical explanation anyone could think of in this case. Authorities were hesitant to fully get on board with the idea, but a fire department spokesperson said he didn't dispute that it was possible. Scientists were also unconvinced. Meteor astronomer Peter Jeniskins told National Public Radio that the blazing streak people saw in the sky was dozens of miles away from Dustin's house, and he further pointed out that most meteorites burn and break up upon entry into the atmosphere. On the rare occasions when a large chunk of meteor makes it to the Earth, they don't start fires because they're typically not hot enough to. The cause of the fire that destroyed Dustin's house remains a mystery. Do you think a meteorite hit Dustin's house? Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 4. A fish downpour. There's often a rock-solid, logical explanation for instances of animal species that don't belong in the sky raining down on an area en masse. But this isn't the case in the remote northern Australian town of Lajamanu, which has seen at least 5 large downpours of fish over the last 3 decades. It most recently happened in early 2023, when residents saw a storm coming and were shocked to see the town blanketed by spangled perch. Freshwater fish were also deposited over Lajamanu in 1974, the mid-1980s, 2004, and 2010. In the most recent incident, locals woke up to find the freshwater fish scattered all over the ground. Many were still alive and flopping around. Scientists aren't entirely certain what causes the phenomenon, but they believe strong updrafts lift the fish out of the water and carry them long distances, sometimes hundreds of miles before they fall out of the sky. Queensland Museum ichthyologist Jeff Johnson told ABC Australia that this happens in a lot of places, including elsewhere in Australia. And while it doesn't happen every day, it's not exactly an uncommon event. But he conceded that the fish that fell in Lajamanu in early 2023 were surprisingly large, and said that it's rare for fish that heavy to travel in the wind due to their weight. At number 3, mysterious white powder. In 1969, the exhaust vents clogged at a Borden Foods factory in Chester, South Carolina, where the non-dairy creamer Cremora was being manufactured. The blockage caused the powdered mixture to seep into the air outside, which reportedly created enough of a mess on its own. But then, it mixed with moisture and fell as sticky, gooey globs of rain. More than 20 years later, in 1991, the company was fined $4,000 over the incident. It was likely a gross and inconvenient experience for locals, but luckily non-dairy creamer isn't a particularly hazardous substance. Residents in Seveso, Italy were less fortunate in 1976, when a white aerosol cloud escaped from a chemical factory. A chemical reactor had exploded, causing a reaction that spewed dioxin into the air. Dioxin is a known carcinogen and environmental contaminant with a long half-life. It's bad for humans, animals, plants, pretty much anything living that it comes into contact with. People who came into contact with the vapor suffered from nausea, headaches, eye irritation, and other immediate symptoms, as well as long-term effects including liver failure, decreased fertility, cancer, and birth defects. The Seveso accident resulted in the highest known exposure of dioxin to a human population to date, and was ranked the 8th worst man-made disaster by Time magazine in 2010. Some of the few good things that came out of it were better scientific understanding of the chemical's effects on the human body and the environment, as well as heightened safety regulations to prevent a similar disaster from ever happening again. Number 2. Space junk. Every now and then, a defunct space satellite falls to the Earth. This is normal and expected, and it may even happen more often than one might assume, considering that there are over 8,200 satellites currently orbiting the planet. In most cases, nobody is hurt by the plummeting space debris. Most of the satellites usually burn up upon entry into the atmosphere, and only a handful of components even make it to the ground. There are even rules in place to prevent space junk from landing on any humans. Under current standards, which are implemented in 2019, the odds of orbital debris killing a person must be lower than 1 in 10,000. Of course, there are older satellites that are still in space and will someday return to Earth, which is not designed or launched with this requirement in mind. Such was the case for NASA's 5,400-pound Earth Radiation Budget Satellite, or ERBS, which was launched in 1984 and made its descent back to Earth in early 2023. Luckily, the odds of debris hitting a person were still very low, and nobody was harmed when the debris landed in a remote part of the Pacific Ocean or Alaska. In fact, experts believe that it was left of ERBS fell in such a far-flung region that humans will never cross paths with it. Satellites aren't the only thing we have to worry about when it comes to space junk descending to Earth, however. For example, unlike other countries, China lets its rocket boosters free fall back to the atmosphere rather than ditching them in a controlled fashion into the ocean or in vast unpopulated areas. But China is apparently going to do what China wants to do, and as things currently stand, other nations have failed to get the country to follow tighter safety measures. Some experts say that there's a 10% chance of a person being hit by falling rocket debris within the next decade, and unfortunately, our only choice is to wait and see if it happens. And at number 1, anchovies. San Francisco residents were flabbergasted when buckets of anchovies rained down on certain parts of the city during the summer of 2022. It happened multiple times over a month-long period and was followed by thousands of dead anchovies washing ashore along the coast outside the city. Local resident Britt Gerhard told the New York Times that she and her husband had just put their daughter to bed when they heard a loud bang on their roof. They initially thought it was an earthquake, but looked outside to see fish flying past their window. The alarming phenomenon wasn't as biblical as it seemed, according to scientists, who told the Times that the strange occurrences simply meant that the anchovy population is thriving. According to marine ecologist Jared Santora, the fish that rained down from the sky most likely fell out of the birds' beaks while they were flying food back to their chicks. In Santora's words, they can only carry so many fish, and some of them fall out. Fish also sometimes get dropped by birds who fight over their catch on top of buildings. Santora describes the practice known as kleptoparasitism as when birds beat up on other birds for its lunch. He further explained that the anchovies that washed ashore were most likely pushed into shallow waters by a predator, then got stuck and ran out of oxygen. Scientists aren't sure why, but anchovy populations reportedly wax and wane. It's normal for their numbers to explode and apparently for the fish to appear in peculiar places during these boom periods. Number 8. HMS Victory. Throughout naval history, there have been at least 6 ships named the HMS Victory. The 6th Victory, ordered in 1758, was arguably the most formidable of them all. She served under dozens of captains and admirals throughout her decades-long career as a Royal Navy warship. Built from over 2,000 oak trees, the 227-foot-long ship came at a cost of £63,176, the equivalent of more than £50 million in modern currency. With more than 104 guns, the Victory was armed to the hilt. It was also much faster than most ships of the time owing to its superior hull design and 4 acres of sails. The vessel first saw combat in 1778 during an encounter between the British and the French in the English Channel, known as the First Battle of Ushant. Although the battle occurred far from the United States, it was a product of the American Revolution. 2 years later, the Victory helped intercept a French naval fleet off the coast of Brittany during another engagement of the American Revolution, known as the Second Battle of Ushant. In 1782, the vessel guided a merchant convoy past a French and Spanish military blockade and into Gibraltar. And in 1797, it fought against the Spanish and won in the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. The Victory's most famous win came during the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, when Lord Horatio Nelson led his outnumbered fleet of 27 ships into combat against a Franco-Spanish fleet of 33 ships near Gibraltar. Nelson's men attacked fiercely and relentlessly, securing an unlikely victory. And while Nelson was fatally shot during the melee, he went down in history as one of the greatest naval commanders of all time. After sustaining heavy damage at Trafalgar, the Victory spent the next several decades serving as a troop ship, a floating depot, a prison ship, and a school. Public campaigns saved the ship from being dismantled and ultimately led to her restoration as a museum. After more than 244 years of service, she's the world's oldest naval vessel still in commission. Number 7. HMS Vanguard. During the late 1930s, the British Royal Navy became worried that its battleship fleet would become outnumbered by German and the Japanese vessels. In a bid to keep up with the competition, they designed the Lion class of 6 fast battleships. According to the plans, the ships would be more heavily armored than the famously solid American Iowa-class battleships, and each Lion-class ship would be armed with 9 16-inch guns and 3 triple turrets. But gun turrets are both expensive and complicated to build, and the British overshot their ambitions and ran into construction delays due to the time required to construct the large-caliber guns. As a result, only one Lion-class ship was ever built. Commissioned in 1946, the 814-foot-long HMS Vanguard was the last battleship built for the Royal Navy. She was also the largest and fastest British battleship ever constructed, and was only exceeded in size and might internationally by the Japanese Yamato and American Iowa-class ships. The Vanguard never saw combat in the Pacific as its designers originally intended, but it was probably for the best. While it was an impressively sturdy and seaworthy ship, it was more lightly armed than initially planned due to some improvisations that were made during its construction for the sake of getting it built. For most of its short-lived career, the Vanguard was used for training exercises. She was put into reserve in 1956 after just 10 years of service and was scrapped a few years later after authorities deemed the maintenance and operating costs to be too high. Number 6. CSS Virginia. Built in Boston, Massachusetts during the 1850s, the USS Merrimack was a 275-foot-long steam frigate that ended up serving on both sides of the American Civil War. When Virginia joined the Confederacy in April of 1861, the ship was tasked with destroying the Union shipyard at Norfolk, but it was blocked by boats that were deliberately scuttled by Confederate forces, giving its crew no choice but to abandon ship. To prevent the Merrimack from falling into enemy hands, they lit it on fire, burned it to the waterline, and sank what was left of it. This didn't stop the Confederates from salvaging the ship's hull, mainly because they were desperate for ships. They rebuilt the Merrimack into the ironclad CSS Virginia in hopes of destroying the Union's Worden ship blockade at the historic Battle of Hampton Roads. And while the newly built ship was certainly formidable, they were in for a surprise. By then, the Union had gotten word that the Confederacy had an ironclad ship, and President Abraham Lincoln had ordered the Union to come up with its own version of the vessel. The Union showed up to the battle prepared, and while its outcome was inconclusive, American forces ultimately took control of Hampton Roads. Number 5. USS Monitor. President Abraham Lincoln ordered the construction of an ironclad warship in 1861 after learning that the Confederacy had ramped up its shipbuilding efforts with the construction of the ironclad CSS Virginia. Dubbed the USS Monitor, the Union built the ship from start to finish in just 3 months, and in 1862, the 179-foot-long vessel set sail from Brooklyn for the first time. Just 2 months later, during the Battle of Hampton Roads in Virginia, it exchanged gunfire with the CSS Virginia. The ironclad Confederate ship that was built with the intention of superseding. After celebrating Christmas on the Monitor later that year, the crew set out for Beaufort, North Carolina, where they planned to join up with 2 other Union vessels and proceed to Charleston as part of a blockade. At that point, the Monitor wasn't seaworthy, and its crew knew it, but they did as they were told. Consequently, the ship's career was short-lived. While being towed out to sea, the vessel encountered a brutal storm. It began rolling uncontrollably and took on water so rapidly that the crew was unable to pump it out faster than it was coming in. They were powerless to stop the Monitor from sinking and had no choice but to abandon ship 16 miles off Cape Hatteras. 47 sailors were rescued by the ship's tugboat and 16 died at sea. The wreck was rediscovered 111 years later in 1973. To protect it from looters, the site became part of the country's first designated marine sanctuary in 1975. Efforts to raise the Monitor began in 1995 and led to the recovery of its anchor turret, as well as the remains of 2 sailors and a gold wedding band. The sailors were given a proper burial, and the salvaged parts were conserved and displayed at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, along with a replica of the ship. Number 4. The Tirpitz. The 832-foot-long Tirpitz was one of 2 Bismarck-class Nazi battleships that served the Kriegsmarine during World War II. It was the heaviest European-made naval battleship of all time, outweighing its sister ship, the Bismarck, by 2,000 tons. All too aware of the vessel's power, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill made it an urgent priority to destroy the Tirpitz. He saw the massive battleship as a threat to Allied shipping and was particularly worried about the Germans targeting Arctic convoys that were en route to the Soviet Union with desperately needed supplies. In an effort to discourage an attack, the Royal Navy spent considerable resources maintaining a naval presence that was capable of putting up a realistic fight against the Tirpitz. For the time being, the Nazis ultimately concluded that it was too risky to undertake any operations in Allied shipping lanes with the ship. Much of the vessel's short-lived career was spent stationed in German-occupied waters off Norway, where its role was to deter a potential Allied invasion. In 1942, the Tirpitz participated in 2 attempts to intercept Allied Arctic convoys. Throughout the following year, it fought against the Allies in Norway. By late 1943, sustained Allied air raids began taking a toll on the ship, but it remained in the region for another year. The final blow to the Tirpitz came in late 1944, when British bombers pelted it with 3 12,000-pound bombs in an air raid codenamed Operation Catechism. As the ship began to sink extremely fast, a deck fire spread to an ammunition magazine, causing a large explosion. Just minutes after being hit, the Tirpitz slipped beneath the waves. German casualties were estimated at somewhere between 950 and 1,200 sailors, while the British suffered 0 losses. In the years following the war, the destroyed ship was broken up and scrapped. Number 3. USS New Jersey. Built during the 1940s, the American Iowa-class battleships were designed to intercept the fastest enemy warships and to act as the fast wing alongside slower naval vessels. It was the first time that the U.S. Navy prioritized speed in a battleship design. Each Iowa-class vessel measured 880 feet long and, according to rumors, was capable of traveling of up to 40 miles an hour over short distances. But until 1968, its top recorded speed was clocked at 37.5 miles per hour by its arguably most fearsome ship, the USS New Jersey. That same year, the New Jersey came out of retirement to serve in the Vietnam War. During its shakedown cruise, Captain Floyd Gooch pushed the engines to their limits, reaching a top speed of 40 miles per hour and maintaining it for 6 hours straight. After that, Captain Gooch ordered its crew to brake at full force. The New Jersey continued moving ahead for another 2 miles before coming to a complete stop. A post-shakedown inspection of the ship found the engine in perfect working order, even after being brutally strained. The New Jersey was slated for inactivation in 1969, and its fellow Iowa-class battleships last saw combat during the Gulf War in 1991. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the US scaled back on its fleet of warships, and by then, the Iowa-class vessels had become more or less obsolete anyway. But they had also come to represent a source of national pride, so they were spared from being scrapped and donated to various museums around the country where they remain to this day. Number 2. Littorio class. Built between 1934 and 1942, the Littorio class of battleships consisted of 3 vessels that served under the Reggio Marina, the Italian Navy, during World War II. The 2 main ships of the fleet were the Littorio and Vittorio Veneto, measuring 780 feet long and nearly 108 feet wide. The Littorio-class ships were designed in response to the French Dunkirk-class fast battleships. Armed with a main battery of 9 15-inch guns in 3 triple turrets and with a top speed of 35 miles per hour, the Littorio, Vittorio Veneto, and their sister ship, the Roma, were both fast and well-armed. Their careers were ironically rather unsuccessful, but their failures had more to do with poor reconnaissance training among their crews than the ships themselves. The Littorio and Vittorio Veneto conducted several sorties in the Mediterranean, but saw little success with intercepting British convoys. They were both torpedoed repeatedly throughout their years of service and became mostly inactive from 1942 onward. All 3 Littorio-class ships were damaged in the Allied attacks the following year, and in September of 1943, Italy capitulated and handed the ships over to the Allies. The Roma was sunk that same month, and the Littorio and Vittorio Veneto were scrapped during the early 1950s, bringing their short-lived careers to an unceremonious end. Number 1. The Yamato. Built for the Imperial Japanese Navy shortly before World War II, the 840-foot-long Yamato was the heaviest and most powerfully armed battleship ever constructed. Knowing their battleship supply was vastly outnumbered by Allied vessels, Japanese naval officials vowed to make up for what they lacked in quantity with sheer size. Construction on the Yamato began in 1937. Despite its size, the Imperial Japanese Navy managed to keep the vessel a secret from other countries. Completed 3 months ahead of schedule, it was at least 30% bigger than any of its enemy ships, and its 69-foot guns were the largest guns ever fitted to a naval ship. Weighing more than 162 tons each, they were capable of firing explosive and armor-piercing shells at a distance of up to 26 miles. The Yamato was also armed with 150 machine guns that were capable of firing 220 rounds per minute. While the Yamato was superior when it came to size and firepower, it fell short in some ways. It was slow, it burned a lot of fuel, experienced a chronic ammunition shortage on board, and spent a lot of time not being used due to its inefficiency. In April of 1945, the ship's crew set sail for Okinawa with plans to fight the Americans to the death in a mission codenamed Operation 10 Go. But the Yamato was sailing without any air cover, and the Americans wasted no time pelting it with bombs. Just minutes after the crew was ordered to abandon ship, the Yamato began to capsize. It quickly rolled over in the water and blew up, claiming all but 280 members of its 2,778-man crew, and resulting in a mushroom cloud that was visible from as far as 99 miles away.
8. Operation Underworld. Collaborations between the US government and the Italian mob are rare, but not unheard of. From 1942 to 1945, the feds teamed up with multiple organized crime factions to patrol the eastern seaboard. Codenamed Operation Underworld, the mission began after the sinking of a luxury liner called the USS Normandy in New York Harbor. Mob boss Albert Anastasia claimed responsibility for the disaster, but the identity of the saboteur remains unclear to this day. Regardless of who is behind it, the explosion triggered growing fears about Nazis and disgruntled Italian Americans potentially causing trouble along the coast. At the time, the Mafia controlled much of New York's waterfront, and it also had influence over the city's Italian population. The alliance ensured that port and harbor workers cooperated with the status quo. High-ranking mobsters provided intel about the goings-on at the waterfront, and hooked Navy personnel up with union cards so they could patrol the docks without any issues. Helping the authorities came at an immense benefit to New York City mob boss Charles Luciano, whose 30 to 50-year prison sentence for running a prostitution ring was commuted on the condition that he return to Italy and stay out of the US for the rest of his life. However, he was released in 1946, and afterward, he was free to return to his life of crime. 7. Las Vegas. Las Vegas was founded in 1905, but it really took off about 40 years later, thanks to organized crime. Until the mid-1940s, the city wasn't even a stopping point along most people's travels to California along US Highway 91. With nothing to offer but the dry desert heat and a rough-and-tumble group of residents, most travelers drove right on by. That all began to change, though, when New York crime lords Mayor Lansky and Frank Costello sent mobster Benjamin Bugsy Siegel to Vegas to see if it was feasible to develop it into a gambling haven. Soon after, casinos began to appear. And as you can tell based on the city today, the developments were a booming success. But the road to getting there wasn't exactly smooth sailing. Siegel secured financing for the construction of the Flamingo Casino and Hotel, which is still around today. But his first several attempts to turn it into a lucrative venture failed. He was unsuccessful in making the Flamingo profitable before an unknown assassin shot him to death in 1947. However, the mob continued with their efforts to turn the Flamingo into an attraction, and their persistence eventually paid off. Throughout the 1950s, the Sands, Dunes, Riviera, Tropicana, and Stardust casinos came along, all courtesy of mobsters. But they didn't only build casinos. Some gangsters became known for their philanthropic efforts, including racketeer and former bootlegger Mo Dalitz, who secured funding for the construction of Sunrise Hospital and was awarded for his contributions to the Anti-Defamation League. The mafia's business involvement in Vegas declined during the 1970s, when ownership opportunities were extended to public corporations. But Sin City wouldn't be what it is today without the mob, who took a desert wasteland and turned it into a world-famous haven of vice. 6. Operation Husky. Prior to the D-Day landings at Normandy, the Allied invasion of Sicily was the largest amphibious operation in history. Codenamed Operation Husky, its success hinged partially on the help from the Italian-American Mafia, which used its connections in Sicily to assist the American naval intelligence with drawing up maps of the island's harbors and coastline. During these negotiations, American mob boss Vito Genovese was brought on board as a translator for the U.S. military in Naples, and he soon became one of the most trusted employees at the Allied Military Government of Occupied Territories, or AMGOT. Mobsters also helped the American military by providing the names of trustworthy Sicilian underworld figures who were friendly to the Allied war effort, and these contacts were put to use under something called the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Special Military Plan for Psychological Warfare, which recommended seeking out disaffected workers, clandestine radical groups, and other potentially valuable connections in Sicily. 5. RICO and Rudy Giuliani. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, is a federal law that went into effect in 1970 as part of the U.S. government's efforts to bring down powerful criminal organizations. In a nutshell, it strengthened the existing laws against organized crime, expanded the definition of a criminal organization, and allowed for harsher penalties. RICO wasn't introduced specifically with the mafia in mind, but it's been used in a multitude of cases against a diverse array of organizations, including the Hells Angels, a drug trafficking group called the Cowboy Mafia, and even corrupt police departments. However, it was federal former attorney Rudy Giuliani's use of RICO against New York's mafia crime families that made it synonymous with the mob. While serving as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, the most prestigious prosecutor's position in the United States, he aggressively fought to take down New York City's 5 families during the 1980s. At the time, the mob was at the height of its power in many ways, and the idea of wiping out its influence was almost laughable. But by applying the RICO law in ways that had never been done before, Giuliani indicted 11 high-ranking organized crime figures and secured multiple convictions and lengthy prison sentences. One way he used RICO to his advantage was by holding mob bosses responsible for the crimes of those working beneath them and going after the organization as a whole, rather than prosecuting gangsters individually for their involvement in crimes. Giuliani's efforts essentially reduced the New York Mafia to the status of a street gang, and it never fully recovered from being knocked down. The five families still exist today, but they no longer have the nearly unchecked power that was once at their disposal. And they'd likely be a lot more powerful if it hadn't been for Giuliani's crusade against organized crime. What do you think is the main reason the Mafia grew to be so powerful in the US during the 1900s? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And while you're at it, subscribe. 4. The Great Depression and the FBI. The 1920s were a disastrous time for most Americans. But for many criminal gangs, the decade came with new business opportunities, and the Mafia was no exception. In addition to bootlegging, organized criminals committed bank robberies, kidnappings, car thefts, drug trafficking, prostitution rings, gambling operations, and more. At a time when people desperately needed money, mobsters also became loan sharks. They loaned money to customers at high interest rates of 20% or more and made sure people paid up. Most borrowers knew bad things would likely happen if they fell behind, so they often prioritized the repayment of these loans over all their other debts. When someone truly couldn't pay, mobsters often took ownership of a portion of that person's business, knowing it would generate cash flow once the economy recovered. Federal law enforcement struggled to keep up with the rising crime, especially since gangs often had local police in their back pocket. The feds were massively outgunned by mobsters and disorganized in comparison, and they knew it. That all changed, though, when a young man named J. Edgar Hoover was brought in to clean house. Taking a no-nonsense approach, he introduced a previously unseen level of structure and organization to the Bureau. Hoover implemented many of the rigorous hiring procedures that remain in effect today, including thorough background checks, physical fitness requirements, and extensive interviews. Hoover also maintained strict ongoing training to ensure that agents didn't slack once they were hired on. In short, Hoover's refusal to let criminals run the show was the driving force that transformed federal law enforcement from a fragmented and understaffed mess to a solidified agency that was capable of combating large-scale crime. 3. Charitable acts. As COVID-19 ravaged Italy in 2020, news headlines reported that mafia members were distributing free food and essential goods to civilians in need. At the time, many people were out of work and had no money coming in, and the difficulty of getting what they needed was compounded by the restrictions that limited when and where people were allowed in public. Some Americans were surprised to learn that organized criminals were stepping in to make up for what the government was failing to deliver. But this actually reflects a long-standing tradition among mobsters of doing at least some good for the community, especially during times of economic despair. During the Great Depression, the notorious American gangster Al Capone ran a soup kitchen in Chicago. While his day-to-day activities typically included things like bribery, extortion, and murder, he also took the time to help the less fortunate. His assistance came in especially handy given the below-freezing and potentially deadly conditions that often come with a Chicago winter. The soup kitchen wasn't anything fancy. It had a sign on the outside that simply said, "Free soup, coffee, and donuts for the unemployed." But at a time when getting a loaf of bread was difficult for most families, people were grateful for a basic meal. At the height of the Depression, Capone's kitchen served breakfast, lunch, and dinner to an estimated 2,200 people every single day. Nobody had to prove that they were in need, as anyone who showed up was fed. The pantry was open daily, including on holidays, which came with a more robust meal than the regular food that was served. While Capone's kindness didn't make him any less of a violent criminal, he and other mobsters have undeniably helped many through their generosity at times when governments failed to deliver. 2. Witness protection. The United States Federal Witness Protection Program, also known as WITSEC, was established in 1970 in response to the growing need to protect federal witnesses in high-profile criminal cases. Throughout the 1960s, the Mafia often murdered those who dared to testify against its members at trial. And as a result, many people refused to come forward or speak with law enforcement. Developed by former U.S. Attorney Gerald Schur, WITSEC has provided new identities to more than 8,600 witnesses and their families, including former mobsters who testified at criminal trials on behalf of the state. Not a single witness who's remained in the program and complied with the rules has been tracked down or killed, although it's a different story for many who have left or been kicked out of the program. Operated by the U.S. Marshal Service, WITSEC erases any trace of a person's former identity, relocates them to a place their enemies wouldn't expect to find them, and provides a cash stipend, as well as help with finding a job and housing. The program is extremely successful from almost every angle. In addition to its unblemished safety record, most of its participants reportedly become functional, contributing members of society, including those who have committed serious crimes in the past. WITSEC may sound like a cushy free ride, since, after all, the idea of being handed tens of thousands of dollars, a place to live, and help situating transportation and employment sounds like a pleasant dream to many people. But it's true that during the early days of witness protection, former mobsters had a tendency to milk the program for things like plastic surgery and other frivolous expenses. Modern witness protection, however, isn't a gravy train, and it comes with stipulations and rules. For one, participants are expected to become fully self-supporting after a certain amount of time. In other words, the handouts aren't infinite, and the program isn't conducive to someone who simply doesn't feel like working. Witnesses are also strictly banned from directly contacting anyone from their past, which has gotten numerous former members kicked out. This rule alone is the reason many people choose not to enter WITSEC, even if it means putting their safety on the line and passing up the opportunity to get a much-needed fresh start. Participants also don't always have a say in where they relocate, and they have to live with the reality of not being able to tell anyone they meet the honest truth about their past. But for those who truly need it, the program has served its purpose well. 1. Gregory Scarpa Jr. Internet legends have long claimed that mafioso Gregory Scarpa Sr. helped the FBI locate the bodies of murdered civil rights workers James Chaney, Michael Schwirmer, and Andrew Goodman in 1964. Scarpa supposedly intimidated members of the Ku Klux Klan into revealing the location of the deceased victims. Many sources cite this version of events as fact, but some researchers question the accuracy of these claims. Investigative reporter Jerry Mitchell clarified the story in the Clarion Ledger in 2014. The main source of the information appears to be Scarpa's old girlfriend, Linda Shiro, who testified to the events in court. But this doesn't appear to be backed up by official records. It is known, based on records, that the FBI enlisted Scarpa's help in mid-1996 with the Ku Klux Klan's fatal firebombing of NAACP leader Vernon Dahmer Sr. in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. According to The New Yorker, Scarpa approached Klansman Lawrence Byrd at his business and shoved him into the back seat of a vehicle. Scarpa then pistol-whipped Byrd and intimidated him into confessing to Dahmer's murder. Records show that someone definitely beat Byrd up, and that he signed a confession for the FBI shortly thereafter. While it's unclear whether Scarpa was behind the beating, it hasn't been ruled out as a distinct possibility. Afterward, Scarpa and the FBI got into a disagreement about his payment, and he was dropped as an informant until the 1980s. Nicknamed the Grim Reaper, Scarpa was a hitman for the Colombo crime family, while also working as an FBI informant. The agency reportedly paid him around $158,000 for his services over the years. And while it may not sound like much now, it was a sizable amount of money decades ago. Scarpa also managed to keep his status as an informant a secret until the mid-90s. Although the leniency shown toward him in criminal court sparked rumors of him being a snitch along the way. However, the law was only so forgiving, regardless of how valuable Scarpa was to them, and he died 1 year into serving a life sentence for murder in 1994. Would you trust eating at a mob-owned soup kitchen if you lived during the Great Depression? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye!